So last week, I announced that I would be spending the remaining sermons that I'm preaching this summer focusing on different emotions. Because, of course, emotions are a huge part of our human experience. And I think it can be helpful to think about how the Bible talks about them and what God would have us do with those emotions. And then you might recall that I went on to talk about one of the emotions that's often considered a negative emotion, sadness. And I argued that sadness, in fact, is a gift from God. Sure, it's not pleasant to be sad, there's no doubt about that, but it has a purpose. Sadness tells us that things are not okay. It refuses to let us carry on with life as normal when something significant has troubled us. Sometimes it gets us in touch with our deepest values and calls on us to reevaluate our priorities of what really matters in life. It can be painful, but it has a purpose. Because like all of the emotions, it was designed on purpose by God. Understandably, this kind of runs in the face of what many of us have been taught for many of our lives, where we're told to put on a smile and be happy and get over it. But if you had a hard time last week when I was talking about sadness, then you're probably going to struggle even more this week when the emotion that we're discussing is anger. Because anger has a particularly negative reputation. Anger is often associated with violence and abuse. Many of the worst things that happen in society happen in the context of anger. Sometimes anger is described as one of the 7 deadly sins, which is not exactly a list in the Bible and which is not exactly an accurate representation of that vice, but I don't need to go down those roads. And admittedly, there are many passages in the Bible, in both Testaments, that caution us about how dangerous anger can be. So, for example, you have this passage from Proverbs that says, "One given to anger stirs up strife, and the hothead causes much transgression." Well, you certainly don't want to have a reputation of being an angry person with proverbs like this circulating around in your community. You have this passage from James that says that everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, slow to anger. Listening seems to be the good virtue that's highlighted in this passage, less so speaking, and even less so being angry. And then you have this passage, even in our reading today, that says, "Put away from you all bitterness and wrath and anger and wrangling and slander." Get rid of it, right? It's not a good thing to have. Well, I would actually insist that none of these passages are speaking about all anger or anger as God intended. I think they're all highlighting what we might call a distorted form of anger, right? So it's true, if you look at this first passage from Proverbs, that a hothead, a person who just gets angry instantly all the time, probably has something that's not functioning right. They're getting upset too quickly, maybe because there's some deep unresolved issues that they have to deal with. Maybe there's something going on in the chemicals of their brain that are making them react the way that they're reacting. Maybe they're not getting enough sleep. That doesn't mean that there's never any appropriate situations in which to get angry. And in the passage from James, it's notable that it says that everyone should be slow to anger. Not that you shouldn't get angry, just that you should be cautious in how you get there. And I think we're going to run into a few of these here, these kinds of anger management tips through the Bible, where we'll find that when we're angry, our instinct is just to immediately try to figure out what the source of the problem is. We're looking for something to blame. And that's a part of how anger functions. Anger is a doer's emotion. It helps us to act. It needs to figure out in black and white terms where the problem lies. But that same value can also become a vice. It can cause us to falsely judge, to too quickly attribute blame, to not see the nuance in situations. And so the scriptures don't call us to abandon anger altogether, but just to be slow and cautious, to hold it in check, to say, okay, well, let's remember that maybe my anger is making this seem a little more simple or one-sided than it actually is. Now, it does sound like this passage from Ephesians seems to be condemning all forms of anger. But I think when you read it in context, you find that even that's not true. I'm actually going to come back to that one at the very end of the sermon. So I just want us to put that kind of in our back pocket here. But for now, I think that probably the strongest passage in Scripture to suggest that anger is not inherently bad are the stories that say that Jesus was angry, right? Jesus was a perfect human being. He lived without sin, the Bible affirms in multiple places. And yet Jesus got angry, and not just on the one occasion. We actually see evidence of Jesus getting angry at several points in the scriptures. But this passage that we hear about of Jesus entering the temple is perhaps the most dramatic one. And so it is worth keeping in our minds as proof that anger is not necessarily bad. Now, I will confess that the passage never actually says that Jesus was angry. Instead, it uses this phrase, zeal for your house will consume me, right? So he's not consumed by anger, he's consumed by zeal. But in this case, zeal is really just a word that's saying that it's anger that is righteous. That Jesus' anger was not self-centered, it was not misguided, it was zealous. It was driven by God's purposes. So what then determines whether anger is zealous, whether it's righteous? Well, we can get some hints in looking at this story. So when Jesus comes into the temple, it says that he finds people selling cattle and sheep and doves, and he sees money changers at the tables. He realizes that there's this entire economic system that has been built around exploiting people, taking advantage of people who come to deal with their religious needs in the temple. And it's taking especially advantage of those who are poor, for whom God welcomes into the temple as a place of healing and redemption, but who all of a sudden find these obstacles standing in the way of them getting there. And it makes him angry. He explains his frustration in saying, "Stop making my Father's house a marketplace." That was not what it was meant to be. And it drove Jesus into what almost might be called a fit of rage. He was irate at what he found at the temple. So anger isn't necessarily always wrong, but we do find these warnings still at Scripture that tell us, that it can be dangerous, it can be unhealthy. So how are we supposed to kind of reconcile these two things to keep the healthier anger in balance with what can be unhealthy anger? And one passage, the other one which Craig read for us from the New Testament, is a passage that many Christians have found to be very helpful and insightful in giving some advice for a good way for Christians to deal with anger. And that is Ephesians 4, especially these verses in 26 and 27. And the first part of that says, "Be angry, but do not sin." Now, it is very important that it starts with the words, "be angry." Very easily, this passage could have said, "Don't get angry," or "get rid of all of your anger," or "suppress your anger." But not only does it allow it, it actually encourages it. There are times when it is appropriate to be angry. But when we are engaging in that powerful, energizing emotion, it's especially important to remember not to sin. And this is consistent with advice that we hear people tell in society. It's consistent with parenting when a parent says to your kid, well, it's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to hit somebody, right? Like that's crossing a line. Or when you hear people speaking on a political scale and saying, yes, to express your anger through marching, through protests, through all the options that democracy gives you, but don't cross the line into rioting or attacking or hurting others. All of this seems to be drawing kind of from the wisdom of Ephesians chapter 4. But I do have to say that it's not always so simple to see when you have crossed the line from anger into something that's sinful, right? We might tell a kid that it's okay to be angry, but it's not okay to hit somebody. But the truth is that hitting or using physical force isn't the only way to harm someone or do damage. There are such things as verbal abuse and emotional abuse. And it does take more discernment than kind of these simple phrases to tell when we have crossed over. Or on the other hand, even a concept like, you can protest but don't riot is one that seems to kind of fall apart when you look at Jesus' own examples. Because Jesus, when he walked in the temple, didn't just walk in holding a sign, right? He was mad. He flipped over tables and drove people out of there. He violated property by the standards and language of our day. I think perhaps one principle that can be helpful in helping us discern when we have crossed over into sin, or at least one practice that can be helpful, is to consider what it is that your anger is seeking to protect. Because at its core, anger is a protective emotion. It sees that something important to us is threatened, that something is wrong, much like sadness does. But while sadness might cause us to kind of slow down and have less emphasis in what we're doing, anger riles us up. It makes us energized. It makes us want to fight for what it is. And there is a sense in which that kind of fighting can be good. But sometimes we get so fixated on what it is that we're fighting that we forget or maybe never even noticed what it was that our anger rose up to protect. And sometimes when we think about that, we find that the things that we're getting angry about, maybe something about our ego, maybe something relating to our privilege, maybe they're not actually worth fighting for when we break it down. At other times we find that it is. The things that we're angry for are justified. And then we have to ask the question whether the ways that we are defending them and advocating for them are actually furthering the protection of that thing, or whether they're making things worse. Because the truth is, if I see somebody who is threatening somebody that I love and I pick a fight with them, I might not necessarily be making things better for me or the person that I love, right? The anger appropriately calls on me to intervene, but we have to think about why it is that we're intervening by listening to what it is our anger is telling us to protect. And then the passage goes on and says, do not let the sun go down on your anger. And this, I think, is especially important because once it goes into this direction, all of a sudden, anger is taking a different form that we're addressing, right? Now, when I've been talking about anger this whole sermon, kind of the type of anger that I've been defaulting to is this expressive, loud, physical kind of anger that sometimes you see expressed in the most outgoing types of personalities. But anger can also be quiet. It can be bitter. It can be passive-aggressive. It can come out in forms that aren't as obvious, but that are just as harmful and deadly. And when it's talking about not letting the sun go down on your anger, what it's really referring to is that anger within. Not the kind that is expressing itself in a loud rage, but the kind of bitterness that can become a problem when it stays within us. And by the way, that is what I believe that those verses at the end of Ephesians are addressing when it says, put away from you all bitterness and wrath and anger and slander. It's talking about that toxic kind of negative anger. Now, you've sometimes heard people say this, often in the context of marriage for some reason. I don't know why marriage seems to be uniquely singled out for this verse. But that, we should never go to bed angry. And I think that's a good principle, but there is a sense in which you can go a little too far with that, right? Like there are some times when you're exhausted and you need to cool down, and the best way to do it is by going to sleep. There might be a situation in which you have a lot of things going on and you don't have time to resolve a conflict or whatever else comes out. I don't think the point of this is to literally say if a certain time of night crosses and you're still angry, you've sinned. It's just to say, really, you shouldn't let much more than 24 hours go by while this anger is still bubbling within you. You need to address it in a timely manner. Because anger, when it becomes resentment, when it lodges within us and isn't dealt with, then it becomes something unhealthy. It becomes something that the devil can use to cause us to act out in bitterness and distrust and revenge. So I think that another comment that I would just make about anger here is that because it's such a powerful emotion, it really does not help for us to suppress it. Oftentimes when we see anger rising within us, it can scare us. We might be afraid of how we could act out to other people. We might be afraid of what we'll do. And it is appropriate at times to cool down, right? To take a break for 20 minutes to let your body reset. There's something wise about doing that. But anger is there for a reason. It's telling us that something matters. It's a way of our souls, or maybe even the Spirit of God, trying to speak to us. And even if it's misinformed, even if it's misfiring, suppressing it isn't going to make it go away. You have to engage it. You have to say, what am I angry about? Oftentimes it means you might have to talk with the person that has caused you to be upset to see if you can resolve it. But if you leave it there, then it becomes, as Ephesians says, a foothold for the devil, a way that evil can really get into our souls. And so I would encourage us to think about anger as another way that God can speak. It is, after all, a part of our nature. God designed us with all of the emotions that we have. God invented anger. And so I encourage us when we feel it, not to flee it, not to suppress it, but to listen and to consider whether it might even be a part of God's voice, or as the Song of Response suggests, a part of God's song.